Hello and welcome to Khyber. Yeah, hey, watch it, you. Welcome to Khyber Shards Answers. It is Friday, so we are doing our Q&A episode with Philip of Thora, uh,
Philip
player
of
of
Thora,
Philip of Thora.
Warden of
I
the West.
haven't been on this side of the microphone. Yes, player of Thora, Philip, in a fun twist where I would host and Philip would answer for his sins and crimes of the past few episodes. So, yeah. Hi, buddy.
Hello.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess just I wanted to kind of we have plenty of questions to get through, but obviously
Sure.
Thora has been heavily featured in the past handful of episodes in terms of the conversations with various members of the Strike Force. And I guess like what I had given you the lead in about some of the stuff that Ari was going to come at Thora with,
hmm
but I'm curious from a GM standpoint. Have you run kind of a persistent, I don't want to say boss NPC, but an organizational leader for the players over a long term? And how does Thora compare to any previous experience you have with that?
I have, but this is very different because Thora's authority is so much more fluid. Uh,
Hmm.
like um, in my in my long One Ring campaign set in Wilderland, I had a party that essentially worked for Bjorn,
Hmm.
but it was because a couple of them were from Bjorn's land, and they had essentially a perception of fealty to Bjorn, and so they took jobs from Bjorn. Had another one later on where they essentially worked for King Bard in Dale, um, and had two of the players playing children of Bard, and so they were working for the benefit of the kingdom. Um, in those games, it was easier in a couple different ways. One, the authority of both of those characters in their own very different sort of polities was absolute, was recognized.
Yeah.
Everyone knew whatever Bjorn says goes. Um, Even though I played them as two very different kinds of leaders. And we had a side campaign that I didn't think worked very well, but where they played people from Rohan and working for King Thengel, the predecessor to Theoden. Um, but the other reason it was easier is because Middle Earth's magical and technological level is so much different.
Hmm.
Once the player characters have a job from their patron and they're out doing the job, there's no way for like the patron to intervene or for them to
Yeah.
check in or anything like that. It's just you're doing your job. You can send a message, but it's going to be weeks before any sort of response could come, so you have to be independent. Thora is a very different kind of case because um, she has a much more direct presence in the lives of the player characters, uh, but also a very different kind of authority, and one that I'm learning. Not surprisingly, but it had never sort of been stated openly that the different characters kind of perceive differently because
Hmm.
Shade raised the thought that um if they didn't do exactly what Thora wanted, she was going to like toss them out on the
Yeah.
street or
Kick him
something
out.
like
Yeah.
that. Yeah. And so the nature of Thora's authority is perceived differently by the player character, by each of the player characters. And her position is a little bit more abstract and fluid. And so that has presented challenges because I don't want Thora to make all the decisions for the player characters. Um, it makes a lot of sense if we think of Thora in this sort of Professor X position, that Thora assigns all the missions, but I don't want it to be the thing
Hmm.
where everything is just Thora says do this, and so you guys go do this. I
Yeah.
like the agency that the characters have in the story, and so um, that has been sort of the tricky part of representing Thora as a leader, and where we are right now with the politicking going on. Obviously there's a sense to which it's going to become necessary that Thora do some of this politicking directly, because otherwise it just starts to feel a little bit silly,
Hmm.
that well, it starts to feel too much like a video game. Thora's stuck in this one spot,
Yeah. I need you to
and
go do this
she
thing
needs you to
because,
like
yeah.
she needs you to run a conversation back and forth for her between these
Yeah.
two people, and it just becomes a series of fetch quests. And so to make her seem alive, it's going to become necessary for her to play a more direct role in some of those things. And so it becomes a matter there of trying not to hold too many conversations with myself,
Hmm.
and trying not to allow Thora to become a DM player character.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and something that I think is really well done by everyone at the table in this campaign, for the most part, is yourself included with the NPCs, is you get the sense that we all take the world seriously. Like if
Hmm.
things are happening, and we don't make a whole lot of conceits for the sake of it being a D&D game, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Right.
Like Ari coming at Thora from a meta standpoint, make, like you said, it makes total sense for Thora to not assert that kind of like authority over the player characters. But at the same time, Ari being like, no, like we signed up for this, like you said you were going to be the like leader of this, and you handled that in stride, and we talked about it beforehand. But I think the same applies to like the way Colin as Pog talked to her in the follow-up conversation of just, you know, we all know that we're playing D&D, but we don't treat our characters like they know they're playing D&D.
Sure.
and
Yeah.
and I think that creates some interesting circumstances where you as a DM or GM like the autonomy and the agency that we as players have to go off and do something crazy in the Feywild for a week. Thor is still going to be mad that we took off for a week. Like your
Right.
teacher's here, you should probably be around because you have students. And so yeah, it's an interesting uh dynamic at the table, specifically with like kind of a school setting. It's interesting.
Hmm.
So um well, we do have some questions, Phil. We have quite a few questions. Thank you to everyone
Excellent.
for all of the questions. We will kick things off with Emily. Um, Emily asks Philip, if Ari had chosen to try and become a Stormlord anyways, despite all the warnings, what would Thora have done? You said in the watch party that it's hard to imagine a situation where she still deals with the Strike Force if one of them became a Stormlord. Could you expand upon that?
Um, so it kind of depends on how this fell out. If the party had, I'm not sure what um what exactly Thora would have, how exactly that conversation would have gone if the party had decided to hold to the idea of Ari as a Stormlord and we're doing this, because there are kind of two paths they can take there. One is, um, Thora yields on that point and we move in that direction, or we have an actual rift develop
Mm-hmm.
where the party is essentially just goes on their own to try and achieve this without Thora's support. And those are obviously yeah, and those are obviously going to be very different circumstances. But I when I said that, I was kind of thinking in terms of Thora, the party going forward with Thora's support. My reason for saying that is, there was kind of a subtext in the conversation where the players and this made a lot of sense for the characters, where the player characters were talking to Thora as if Ari would become a Stormlord, but Thora would still run House Tarkanan.
Hmm.
And I just don't think there's any logical circumstance in which the the head of a school, outranks a Stormlord. Like, Thora's not
Yeah.
going to be bossing Ari around, or giving Ari missions, as a Stormlord. And I don't know if the player characters, if that went home to the player characters or not, because that was kind of what Thora was trying to get at with Ari, because Ari comes in and saying, we need your guidance, we need your leadership, we need you to tell us what to do, and also I'd like to outrank you now.
Yeah.
Is Thora's view of that conversation. And I don't know that that's what how Ari perceived
No.
that
Yeah.
ask, like,
Yeah.
or if Ari still imagined Thora as somehow still maintaining a leadership mentorship role that somehow outranked him, even if he
Hmm.
was now Stormlord.
Yeah.
um and Thora, for better or worse, I don't think Thora would be willing to go along with that kind of arrangement, partly just because it would be very complex, but I think also partly because if one of you is going to go for this, Thora is not going to undermine you by still being the person who, you know, tells you how to manage life.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
So yeah, so that's what I meant. Not that Thora would like write them off and never speak to them again. I mean, you know, I guess, suppose one could push Thora to that point, but that Thora's not going to be the party's patron anymore if one of the party outranks Thora.
Hmm. No, that's fair. Cool. Um, from Chris, new member of the Discord. Welcome, Chris.
Hey.
Philip, I've been mulling this over. Was Thor's reaction to Ari's request something of a narrative trail marker to keep the strike force on track? It feels like having a PC as a city leader could really shake up the campaign dynamics. I recall from an earlier KSA that you're a pretty player-driven DM, so I know you wouldn't shut the players down if that's the direction they wanted to go. I'm just curious about your approach in guiding the narrative. Do you often place trail markers to suggest a path while still allowing for the players to navigate?
Uh, no. I mean, yes, I do often do that. No, Thora's reaction was not really pre-planned. Eric bringing up the idea, uh, of Ari wanting the job, fit with a lot of things that Eric had said about Ari, and that Ari had set up, but it wasn't something that had occurred to me ahead of time. And a lot of Thora's reaction to it, Eric told me a couple days ahead of time, and I kind of had some time to mull it over. But a lot of Thora's reaction was kind of developed in the half hour or so before we actually
Hmm.
sat down to record. Um, Now, the earthquake is definitely a trail marker, to use your term, um, in that this is a big event that I had in my head for a while, in my kind of what are the steps of Cool Seer's plan
Hmm.
uh, outline, and it it honestly, I hadn't actually occurred to me to get rid of a Stormlord initially, um, but it was I had a few different repercussions for the earthquake in mind, but all of them kind of focused around Cross and the school. And then Darren made kind of an offhand comment that there was like a whole campaign's worth of um, consequences
Yeah.
in an event like that. And that caused me to sort of broaden my scope a little bit and think, well, that would be an interesting, what if one of the Stormlords is missing? But I couldn't plan for Thora trying to become a Stormlord as a trail marker, because I actually didn't know what the party would do when asked to go find a Stormlord. Like, I didn't know if they would actually just rescue Wilkes and, use that to get influence, because that
Hmm.
would have been totally a path, is you actually
Yeah.
rescue Wilkes, who's obviously a coward
Hmm.
and not very interested in being the person who does his job, and use your rescuing of him to gain influence over him. Like that would have been another possible route to take.
Yeah.
I think this is a very interesting route, and I like the one that we're on. But yeah, so no, Thora wanting to become a Stormlord and Ari wanting to become Stormlord, these were not things that I had necessarily planned, because Jonas going missing was later, was kind of a light development, and not knowing what the party would actually do with Jonas going missing. Um, so the earthquake is more what you're describing, rather than specifically this. Certainly, you're right. It would significantly change the dynamic. It will change the dynamic of the campaign for Thora to become a Stormlord. Because that will be a huge shift in what the scope of their organization can be.
Hmm. Very cool. Um, I'm going to combine Chris's second question and a question that Emily has further down because they're in the same vein. So, Chris asks, also, has Thora given thought to the impact of her potentially leaving the school on the kids? I know she's not keen on being an emotional support, but it seems like running a school for kids who've had traumatic experiences with their friends and family being afraid of them would make it tough to avoid that. Just how involved is she in the kids' lives? I've heard the meta comparisons to Professor X, but does she really have that level of involvement with the students? And then Emily kind of expands on that by saying, obviously, she doesn't want to be a mother figure to the strike force, but is she willing to act as a mother figure to the students? If yes, is this more due to the fact that they're actual children whom she's responsible for taking care of, as opposed to adults who work for her? Or is this more connected to how she doesn't have the Black Wheel based baggage with the children like she does with the strike force? So,
Uh, I do imagine that Thora is more willing to try and help the children on an emotional level, because Thora has trained, and Thora has led in a military situation, and in a small unit kind of thing, like what Thora was involved in as the commander. She's necessarily involved on an emotional level with people around her. Um, but I think she's really bad at it. I don't think she knows, how to deal with the kids so much on an emotional level. Like, she probably really understands um, how to approach and deal with someone like Nasaria, because she's a rule follower. Like, Thora can talk to Nasaria, and Nasaria's taking notes,
yeah,
and so she's someone that is a rule follower. Even shoot your kid
Kara?
Kara, even Kara, who's very much more on the the school punk kid kind of vibe.
Hmm.
um that's an archetype, the sort of anti-authoritarian that Thora would probably have some experience with and understand how to deal with. Mo and Pip, I don't think she would really have a very strong notion of how to deal with them, how to deal with what's up with those two. Like, they're just a very different kind of chaos.
The cadence of the
Uh,
sentence, for some reason, I thought you were going to finish it with Mo and Pip. She probably doesn't even know their names. Like, just, I don't know why that's where Mo just avoids them. Like,
and kind of the same thing with Donabella. Uh, Thora's approach to Donabella is probably very much, okay, you need to be really good at using your mark. Like, that's the thing that we're going to unlock with you. And so I could imagine, Thora spending a lot of time working to get Donabella
yeah.
complete control over what her mark does. Um, and so she knows, I think, how to approach a lot of the kids in a training situation or academically, but I think that she's not really very well equipped to deal with them very effectively emotionally. So I willing and able aren't necessarily the same thing. And so with the strike force, yes, some of it is the guilt that she feels over her involvement with Black Wheel. Um, some of it is their age, but a lot of it is more, okay, you're old enough for me to say I'm not your mom. Don't come to me with this kind of thing.
Hmm.
Whereas, while Thora's not a touchy feely person, she's also not a sociopath, and she knows that that saying that to actual children
Yeah.
is not how you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean the school desperately needs someone brought in who can handle that side of the kids' needs, which is
Hmm.
why the school really needs to hire Mrs. Brightdoom in just a guidance counselor
Yeah.
capacity, if nothing else.
um and kind of the first part of, have you or has Thora given a lot of thought to the impact
Mm.
on the kids of her leaving?
Um, Probably not a lot, uh, but at the same time, um, Thora would imagine needing to hand over the actual operation of the school, but becoming a Stormlord wouldn't cause Thora to just vanish from
Yeah.
the school. That's probably still where she lives. Like there is a building where the Stormlords have offices, but each of the Stormlord mostly operates out of somewhere else. Like Paolo Marin operates out of the Forge, Lassite out of the brewery, Silshadra mostly operates out of the Red Ring. Like
Hmm.
the Stormlords operate, have official offices, but usually they would be, if they, again, if they're NPCs in a video game, which I guess there is a video game set in Stormreach, so they probably are somewhere. But
That's true.
if they're NPCs in a video game, the place where you would go to get quests from them is not the Lore Smarch Palace. It would be
Hmm.
in one of the districts that they run.
Yeah.
Help me out there. So from Thora's perspective, that would be the school. The the tricky thing is whether or not the school is in a district that Thora would be Stormlord over, and whether we have to figure out how to move the school physically in order to make
Just
make that work.
push really hard on the side of the
Yeah.
island. Just yeah. Very cool. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but Emily asks, how long have you been planning on Thora trying to become a Stormlord for? I know that Eric mentioned the possibility of Thora just Eric mentioned this being Ari's mentality, just to be clear. Eric mentioned the possibility of Thora just using the school as a stepping stone to become a Stormlord if the opportunity rose, and this having been her plan before she pitched Grimalkin Academy to the Strike Force. Is that an accurate read of her?
um okay, so that's two very different questions. So how long have I planned on this? This notion just occurred, the opening of of a vacancy on the Stormlord Council is something that just occurred to me
Yeah.
after we had already run the earthquake, after we had already started in on the dungeon where they encountered Kulsir. So for me, the idea of Thora becoming a Stormlord is rather a late development, and I wasn't 100% sure that's where the party would go. Even if they decided to get rid of Jonas, I could imagine there are lots of powerful NPCs that the party have developed relationships with. The party could totally, I could see them um, deciding to back Drago Thule for a Stormlord
Colseer.
position, uh, as a way of garnering greater favor, and in exchange for him
Yeah.
guaranteeing protection for the aberrant marked individuals in the city. So there were lots of ways they could have tried to capitalize on this opening. Thora or anyone from House Tarkanan becoming a Stormlord is certainly the most ambitious, and so I'm not at all surprised that that's where the PCs go, because that's usually where player characters want to go, is for the biggest possible swings. So, um, Yeah, not long planned. Um, as to whether it was in Thora's head, that's harder to say. Eh, I imagine Thora as someone who thinks a lot of steps ahead. I think it's probably not the case that Thora would be looking at the school quite that cynically, because there are probably better ways to set yourself up to jump to Stormlord than what Thora has done. Um, I mean, if Thora wanted to had come to Stormreach and decided I'm going to become a Stormlord, then the most effective thing to do would have been to cozy up to Wilkes and then get rid of him.
Yeah.
Because Thora is insightful, she would have been able to size up which of the Stormlords was the most easy to manipulate. So, not looking at the school that cynically, would Thora think ahead to eventually translating this into actual political power in the city? Yeah, I mean, that seems likely that that's a possibility that would have occurred to her somehow, but certainly not in the sense of the school is somehow going to help me get political power.
Hmm. Gotcha. Um, Another question from Chris about Thora's origins. If you were to build Thora as a PC at the start of a campaign set during her and her team's exploits in the last war, what class would you make her? Would she be the same as she is now, or do you imagine her having a different path?
I'd probably build Thora as a Soul Knife rogue. Um, uh, I kind of like went around and tried to come up with is there a cool multi-class, because I've never like established how many levels Thora has.
Yeah.
But if I was going to build Thora and play her, which would be super rad.
I saw that question. It was like, Philip's really going to want to do that now. Like,
Yep. Soul Knife Rogue maybe multi-classed into a Battle Master Fighter, like to do the whole tactical team
yeah.
lead kind of thing. Would probably be a pretty solid build for her, because I've never played her as having magical abilities outside her mark, and so I
Yeah.
don't think some of the like bard options or something like that would be
Gotcha.
where I would go. So that would probably be how I would build her. Yeah.
Okay. I bet we could get Mia to guest as the Dane player on that.
I think we probably could. Yeah.
Set that as like a sub goal for the channel or something. Um, Secondly, I'm curious about the recent friction between Thora and the party. Was that something you expected to happen, or is it taking you by surprise? And how did you, as the DM, expect Eric to react when Ari got shut down? Is that in line with how Thora expected Ari to react?
I assume and hope that this is what happened, that Eric would enjoy that conflict. And when the idea of locking Ari in the closet as a way of demonstrating his naivete occurred to me, I just thought it was really silly and also funny and also pointed. And so that amused me, and I really enjoyed the look on Eric's face when that occurred. So that was satisfying in seeing Eric's reaction. I think Thora imagined at the end of that conversation that Ari had gotten it. And so when Ari came back the next day and obviously hadn't told the other player characters anything and hadn't seemed to have finalized a decision and yet wanted to get started on this project, I think that's where Thora was a little at a loss of how to handle this delicately anymore, because we can't put this conversation off and still move forward, was her perception, which is why she dropped that in the way that Ari probably wouldn't have preferred it done. So I didn't. Well, I mean, obviously, I had some lead in for Ari's interest in this. I really didn't know how the other player characters would react.
Ari's issue with how Thora did it would have been so much less handful of days earlier, but he like going into that conversation was on a tightrope with two of the party members, and it was like, no, like they're gonna think that I was keeping this from them, and that's not gonna
Hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. I wouldn't when all those conversations happened back to back to back to back to back. I was, oh man, this is going to be this is going to be rougher than it needs to be. No, I really had no idea how the other player characters would react to Ari's plan, Ari's just interest, or to Thora's reaction to them. I really like the fact that Ari didn't tell anyone about his conversation with Thora or what had happened, or why he hadn't picked up his. No one asked Ari why he hadn't answered his communicator or anything like that, so it didn't come up.
Mhm.
But yeah, I just went in. I was totally blind as to how the other characters um, would react to that. I could tell they all had made an assumption about who they would try to put on in the seat, but I had absolutely no idea how they would respond to Ari's interests or to Thora's reaction to Ari's interest.
Yeah. And I think part of, and I may be misspeaking, Chris,
Mhm.
but like the additional friction with like the Solarca conversation kind of coming
Yeah.
into the party's interaction with Thora. I since it's interesting because you were also the driver of the Solarca conversation to a certain
Hmm.
extent. So yeah, I mean, as a GM, you want to talk through like having one NPC work against the like another NPC, if that makes sense. Like it's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah. Well, Solarca. I- So with the important NPCs, I have tried to have notes on their values, like
Hmm.
on their drives and values, and Um, Solarca, the thing that makes Solarca get along with Pog is both of them have a very romantic idea of heroism, a very clear picture of what makes someone heroic and uh, what heroes should do. And so Solarca, obviously, what you guys just did was not heroic. Um, Thora is not cynical exactly, and it's not. I didn't want Thora to come across as like Machiavellian or something like that. That's much obviously that's very much Cel Shadra's department
Yeah.
in our story, but Thora's very clear eyed about how the world works, and so Thora's thought is much more. Yes, that's wonderful. And when we can be heroic, that's awesome and we should. But some of the time, in
Hmm.
order to achieve something, you got to compromise. And so it was a very interesting conversation because it was like having the conversation at two different stages of an adventurer's life. Solarca is a very young adventurer with a very strong ideal of what adventure is going to mean.
Yeah.
And Thor is a retired player character who's gone through a very morally gray campaign as a
Hmm.
as a Black Ops team. Um,
It's the type
and
of campaign
that's
I would run.
right.
Just
Yes, absolutely. Like Thora's a PC who's been through a BioWare influenced Eric campaign. She's someone who's on Commander Shepard's team and
right.
has survived, and has her experience has her worldview colored by that experience. And so yeah, I knew that this was probably going to raise things about Thora. And I intended Thora's approval of this mission to be something that drew your attention, because I wanted it to sort of get across the precariousness that Thora perceives in the position that you guys
Hmm.
hold right now.
Yeah.
Like in that sense, Thora agrees with Shade about power. It's just more nuanced than Shade's position.
Shade lacking nuance. Stop it. We already asked that question from Emily. So Emily asks, maybe I'm misremembering and she's used it before, but is there a reason why Thora hadn't used her telepathy in the campaign prior to communicating with Ari after she locked him in the basement?
uh, okay, sort of. So it I went back because I thought when I read this question, I immediately thought, well, no, she used that right at the very beginning. And I went back and I watched the scene in the alley fight where Thora appears for the first time, and realized that I didn't describe it very well. You guys were on a rooftop and she was on another rooftop across the alley, and she
Hmm.
was talking to you all, and I kind of intended that to be your hearing a voice,
Hmm.
but I didn't describe it very effectively as coming through. And there was a lot going on in that scene that
Super chill
that I
mode.
didn't expect to be going on when we sat down, and so it was a very different experience, and things got lost in the weeds. But that was my intention, was that Thora was going to use that to communicate with them across the way in a very loud situation, because can't really whisper
Yeah.
over an alley from one roof
Yeah.
to another. um so that probably just didn't come through, but that was my intention. uh as to why she doesn't use it more often, I I just think telepathy is an extremely intrusive thing to do.
Yeah.
Like, I can't believe that in a world where lots of people would have telepathy, that it's polite to do it without asking.
Hmm.
And so Thora's telepathic ability is much more limited. Soul Knife can't just do it whenever. And so it's a resource she can use. And so she doesn't use it needlessly, which is why they have the communicators, so that they don't have to try and also they can communicate with each other that way, not just her. Um, but yeah, I mean, part of it is Thora doesn't want to just insert herself into someone's head
Yeah.
without permission, except to make a point. Uh, and also, it's a more limited resource for a soul knife than it is for someone with true telepathy like Ari
She
or Esri.
she had just got done locking somebody in a closet. Consent was kind of out the window at that point. So, you
Yes,
might
that's
as
true.
well in for a penny.
You had been kidnapped, so sorry, rescued.
Rescue napped. Uh, um, awesome. Okay. This next question from Emily, this is for the viewers, has footnotes. I'm not going to get into the footnotes. Thank you, Emily, for the clarifications. If you would like to see the footnotes, the link to the Discord is down below. But Emily asks, on a similar note, am I safe to assume that her soul knife abilities, especially the telepathy, are not at all connected to the Zoriat rune they found in the basement? Considering that her office is closest to the basement, she has uh, hereto unused telepathy from an unknown source, and she was the one who first pointed out the Zoriat rune. I have a mild sense of concern that the Zoriat rune has started to affect her.
I mean, well, now, of course, no. No, no, that was not my intention to connect those two things. Uh, Thora's soul knife abilities predate this, so no, it was not my intention to suggest that radiation from Zorat is leaching through the walls into Thora's office.
God.
But man, you're good at the details.
Yes. Yes. Emily, if you're not running a campaign, you should be, because the way your mind works is terrifying in the best way.
Oh yeah.
Um, Final question from Emily. After the fight with the Thorani monk, Thora mentioned wanting to send help to the strike force but being unable to. If she had been able to send help, whom would she have sent?
Thora has um, connections. in a few different areas. Some of them are connections that Ari and the Strike Force have fostered. There's, I mean, nobody's really happy about it, but there are Swords of Karin patrols wandering around Cross, and
Mm-hmm.
Thora could certainly have probably arranged for one of them to run over and covered them if they didn't also have a hostage, which would obviously complicate that.
Yeah.
Thora still has some personal connections to her old work in the Citadel, and so there are still, we presented Lucan as that in particular, although we did also observe some of Lucan's team, and so Thora has some connections in her old job of people she could probably call in favors from,
Yeah.
not organizationally but individually, uh, and
Whatever happened to
so
Natalia, our tiefling friend?
yeah, we brought her in and then never really used her again. I part of that is honestly I realized just moments after doing that was a mistake, because what I should obviously have done is introduced Lucan into that role
Mm,
to allow you guys to start building a rapport with him to make it more interesting later on.
that's fair.
And so I kind of shifted to try and bring Lucan into the story more times, in order to, to at least get some familiarity with him so that it would be, um,
Yeah, more
in some way
meaningful.
motivating. I mean, he was never y'all's best friend or anything like that, but he was at least not just some random person
Some
that you're
dude.
chasing.
So
Yeah.
you're telling me I can remove Natalia from my NPC master list that I
Not necessarily.
have? Okay. And Mia, under the wire by 3 hours. Mia, you were fine. Um, uh, if I'm not too late, Philip, I know you were aware of the potential romance between Shade and Ari, but were you aware that Eric would have Ari desire to be a Stormlord? Your response as Thora was intense. The tense was all caps.
Uh,
That was a very
yes.
present tense, Mia. Very present
Huh.
tense.
Yes, Eric did do me the favor of letting me know the very rough outline of what Ari wanted to talk to Thora about, so that I wouldn't have to entirely make that up off the fly. Um, but like I said, that was something that I kind of worked up the locking him in a closet thing, just as a bit. Honestly, I thought it was funny. Just a little bit before the content of her conversation was not. I actually spent a few minutes working up like different ways she could get him to walk into the room ahead of her,
Hmm.
just and have the action economy to lock him in there, and then he just did it like it was nothing. It required no effort at all, which was perfect, like
Yeah.
from both her perspective and mine. So it a lot of what I spent the most time trying to work up was, how do I say this without raising any red flags
Hmm.
for Eric.
Yeah.
um and in the end that was entirely unnecessary, so most of the conversation was improvised. The specific action uh was not so much. um yeah, I Thora is a character, one of the handful of characters in this campaign that I feel like I really do know very well, and can portray, I think, quite effectively. um and I kind of wanted it to come across that Thora thinks this is a really terrible idea, but also doesn't just. Thora thinks Ari is in that position is a great idea in 20 years.
Hmm.
Um, and so in the sense of Ari as a asset's the wrong term. Um, but
especially to
Ari
Ari.
as
Uh,
yeah, yes, especially to Ari. But um, well, to Ari's point about desiring that Thora be more of a mentor to him, um, I wanted Thora's response to not be dismissive because from a training and mentorship perspective, that's obviously going to shut down Ari, and she doesn't really even want to shut down this ambition in Ari. She wanted to try and get Ari to see that he was not ready
mhm.
for this, that he was not equipped to do this successfully yet. And because I think the sequel to the conversation went the way that neither of them wanted it to, because Thora expected that Ari would come in having told everyone before we moved on. Like Thora figured the next time we talk about the Stormlord thing, Ari is going to have worked this out and also told his friends anything that he needs to know.
Yeah.
Which is why she tried to ask him this in a cryptic way, because, if Ari had taken Thora's point, gone away, decided, well, no, I'm not going to pursue that, it would make total sense for Ari also to not tell the
Yeah.
other PCs. And so Thora kind of tried to get an opportunity for Ari to just sort of go, and
Yeah.
then we just move on. But when Ari gave her back a cryptic affirmative, it became necessary to tell, and that
Yeah.
basically made that conversation impossible to have in a productive way.
Mhm.
And so I would say Thora probably does not like the way the sequel conversation went. She's probably not, thrilled with the way the first conversation went, in that Ari did not seem to download what she was trying to tell him, or at least didn't agree with what she was trying to tell him.
Mhm.
Um, and so Thora doesn't want to take Ari to well, Ari's ability to get knocked off the rails um, is manifest, is evident. We have seen something substantial goes wrong, and Ari can spiral. Like we've seen Ari spiral about friendships. Like we've seen Ari spiral about his control of his mark, which is another conversation Thora still has not been able to have
Yeah.
with Ari, given the new
Ari
the new
has
reality.
potentially the most powerful aberrant mark in the world at this point, and yeah,
Right.
just not near the top of the list of discussion currently.
Yeah. Like so um there's probably a realization in Thora in the conversation, or what I wanted there to be was this realization in the conversation from Thora's perspective, that if I do this right, I mean if I do this wrong, I'm going to ruin Ari.
Mhm.
Like Ari will no longer be what makes him valuable and what makes him um a an asset to the team, like what
Yeah.
makes him a strong character, because I could totally imagine the conversation going spectacularly badly and it totally wrecking Ari's confidence, just
Mhm.
from the way you have played Ari and my own memories of being in my 20s. Um, and so, yeah, uh, hence
Well, and
the
it's
object lesson.
yeah, and it's interesting, and I've resisted every impulse to discuss Ari because this is a Thor episode, but I do want to kind of
Sure.
riff off what you're saying, because you mentioning Thora, like what makes Ari an asset to the team, and I think that's really kind of the current crisis that Ari is undergoing, is he doesn't even know what that means, like him being an asset to the team, because like in the conversation with Esri where Ari was kind of like, I'm good, like talking with people. I'm good, like
Mhm.
the political sphere is where I feel like I would really excel, not going out to kidnap stormlords. Like, that's not my skill set. And so that's kind of his current crisis, is like, I feel like I'm being used in a manner that is antithetical to my morals, and also not highlighting what I'm really good at. Because also he acknowledges that in those intensity situations, he does not handle stress super well, and also his companions, because we're all in our 20s or teen years, don't handle stress super well. And so
Sure.
negotiations in the field tend to fall apart rather quickly. So even the skills that he has in the field tend to go sideways pretty quickly, which makes total sense. But that's kind of Ari's current crisis, is like,
Yeah.
yeah, um, he doesn't he doesn't feel recognized by Thora, which is an
Yeah.
interesting dynamic that on
Yeah. Well,
Thora's end, she's trying to protect that. Yeah.
and then on a larger scale, Thora realizes, as Ari clearly does, the the value of this opportunity. And here is where I think Thora and Ari's positions would diverge the most. Um, Thora thinks Ari's gonna make a mess of it.
Hmm.
Like, if in the position, Thora's, Thora's older. She's had more opportunity to become a little more jaded. Ari's still very optimistic, and so Ari's notion that, let's take the person with the biggest aberrant mark ever and say, "Hey, Corvair, I'm part of the government of Stormreach
Yeah.
now. Ha!
Yeah.
Deal with it." Um, there's there's a lot of you know awesome cheer on kind of sense about that, just from a perspective of anyone who values rights.
Yeah. 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 Well,
um
yeah.
but Thora's life experience has made her a little more conservative, in the sense of incremental, in
Yeah.
the sense of, well, what if first we got people comfortable with the idea of someone with a mark
Yeah.
before we went for the most marked person that we've got.
Yeah. And that's something that I'm excited to enter the more political sphere as insofar as we can, because I haven't really gotten a chance to. But my intention has always been, Ari is a revolutionary. Like,
Hmm.
like uh he wants to get the dragon marked houses out of Stormreach, not in a violent, like, burn it all down way, but like, Ari's really adamant about that. Like, he is, I would call him a pretty radical revolutionary when it comes to the dragon marked houses.
Yeah,
And so yeah, I'm excited to dabble into that, but also the conflict with Thora of, and I mean that, you know, it's a very familiar, like, the slightly older person that shares the values and
sure.
everything, and it's like, slow down a little. It's like, no, like, we can't slow down, we got to go. So yeah.
Well, and
um
it's we have, I mean, to look at it like, um our inspiration was X-Men for a lot of this, and to look at X-Men, and X-Men was, of course, a commentary on civil rights, and the specific civil rights movements of the 70s and 80s and 90s, with the gay rights movement. And obviously, when you look at something like those movements, it's easy to look at incrementalism as not desirable, right? I
yeah,
mean, rights are
potentially lethal.
rights, and you've either got rights or you don't, and that's,
Yeah.
you can't sorta have rights. And so I think it is an interesting conflict, because you look at things like, you look things like the Civil Rights Acts from the 1960s, and all of the, from a political history standpoint, and all of the compromise, and all of the little tiny things that had to be given up or had to be done in little tiny stages.
Hmm.
And of course, the downside of anything like that is, what if we don't get all the way across the goal line? Like,
Yeah.
if we make it to where we're going to take just a tiny bit of this at a time, and then we never actually make it across the goal line, then none of
Yeah.
it mattered.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it is a very interesting um, conflict in playing the long game versus going for broke.
Yeah. And I think the way, especially once we got into Stormreach, that the conflict between like the oppression of the aberrant marked people in general has been portrayed in Stormreach isn't particularly deadly. Like we're not being
Right.
hunted or like literally killed in the streets. So it's a very different thing from what a lot of the real world parallels would
Yeah.
be, because
Right.
there is a lessened sense of urgency. That the biggest source of conflict that we've seen is Mrs. Bright Doom being distrustful of us when she first met us, but we were also in her home, so fair. And the people protesting the school are really the
And
only big.
Blackwheel, like
And
the sort of
Blackwell, yeah, yeah,
shadow of Blackwheel still being
yeah,
there.
yeah,
And I think that's, yeah. So I've kind of intended that, and the specifics of aberrant marks in Baker's world um, isn't the focus of a lot of writing, other than just his clear statement: aberrant marks are actually dangerous. It doesn't make
yeah,
it okay to be mean, to be terrible to people. Um, but what I've kind of tried to look at is, the problem isn't necessarily that people see someone with an aberrant mark and pitchforks come out. It's that an organization like Blackwheel is able to operate without anyone in power doing anything about it. Like,
yeah,
it's possible that that existed, and also that, while they did sort of shut it down at the end of the war when attention was going to be drawn back, we've given no indication, and that anyone like suffered any kind of consequences
yeah.
for it. So it's that no one was punished. People would gladly start it up again. And so what I wanted for the conflict was not so much that people are like throwing rocks at you guys in the streets, but more that right now everything's okay because Blackwheel fell apart.
Yeah.
But what happens next time? Who will stop us? And brought that to the forefront in the aftermath of the Red Ring, when you guys are sitting in the Stormlord's office while they haggle with the houses as to whether or not to sell you. And so that was kind of what I wanted in terms of this hanging over you, because I felt like the people threw rocks at you in the streets thing was just going to be too much.
Fairly disruptive to go into
Yeah, to being
going
adventurers.
going to
Yeah,
see Solarka.
yeah. So that's um yeah, that's
Well,
kind of where I landed with it.
and I think that was a good spot to land, because I know in our session 0, I think it was something I specifically brought up. Like I really wanted the location that we were in to feel like a character into itself, and to have a strong cast of NPCs that we could interact with. And if you ramped up the level of distrust and hatred that Aberrant marks, to where like every relationship we try to establish, we have to overcome this initial hurdle of like,
Yeah.
oh, you're marked. It would have been
Right.
exhausting, and probably we would eventually stop trying. It would be like, I don't want to go through 6 weeks of trying to get this
Right.
person to like me. So
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
So
So,
well, Philip, I think that is, well, I know that's all the questions. I'm looking at the Discord. So that is all the questions. I hope that you all enjoyed this, Philip. I hope you had a good time
yeah.
getting in the hot seat for a change. And thank you all for watching. New Khyber Shards on Monday, new Khyber Shards answers on Friday. I've been Eric. That's been Philip. Thanks for rolling with us. I did it.
Well done.